Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. One of the definitions of faith in the Bible is that faith is the conviction of things not seen. Faith is the conviction of things not seen. Now, I wonder, everybody, if we like that definition of faith. That to be a person of faith is to have a conviction about things not seen. I once heard this story about the lone survivor of a shipwreck. After being the only remaining sailor from his ship, this survivor, he found a lifeboat and he got on it and he quickly rigged a sail. And after he got the sail rigged, he did what he had been trained to do. He looked up to the night sky and he began to read the stars so that he could chart a way home for himself. And so once he gets his little boat in the right direction, he's exhausted and he falls asleep. Well, the next evening comes around, and when it does, it comes with it a thick cover of clouds. And the sailor is no longer able to look up at the night sky to read the stars. And the clouds, they hang for 20 nights straight. Now, it doesn't take long for the questions to begin to hit him, to barrage him. That he can't look up at the stars. He's now wondering, am I headed in the right direction? Am I going the right way? Am I horribly lost and destined for a terrible death? Without the stars in sight, he has no way to be sure. He starts to wonder if that first night when he did see the stars, if he had read them right, or if he had just imagined it. Or he thinks to himself, did I see truth once, and now I have to keep moving forward without any further assurances? He's full of questions without sight. Have you ever been there? Have you ever wondered if you're headed in the right direction? Have you ever felt blind to where it is you're going or to all of the things happening around you? And have those questions ever touched your faith, your relationship with God? Have you ever, in the hiddenness of our faith, wondered or had difficulties or hesitancies about your life of faith and about Jesus? This weekend we celebrate the ascension of Jesus into heaven. It is the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, but it is by far not the end of everything. We'll get to the Feast of Pentecost next Sunday. But the Feast of the Ascension, it's so important because it tells us two things. It means that Jesus is as alive right now as he was 2,000 years ago when he walked this earth. Jesus, living and reigning in heaven, is alive. It also means that Jesus ascended into heaven is now always and everywhere present. Jesus is always and everywhere present. But Jesus' ascension also means that none of us can just board a flight and go visit him. In that first reading today, we heard how the ascension went down. How these great clouds lifted Jesus up and out of the sight of his disciples. And we know what happens when something goes from being seen to unseen. Questions start to rise in us. Because faith is a conviction about things not seen. Now, we would not be alone in this. In our gospel today, well, we heard about how in this post-resurrection account of Jesus with his disciples, when Jesus comes to them, they worshiped him, but they doubted. And this is puzzling, but it's also reassuring. It's puzzling because they could see Jesus. They could take him all in. But it's reassuring because though they worshiped, they doubted. And this tells us that faith is not the absence of questions. To be a person of faith is not to never experience difficulties or hesitancies. To be a person of faith is not to have the full picture, to see how everything fits together, to have complete understanding. No, to be a person of faith is to place our trust in someone who does have the full picture, who does have the full understanding. And so they worshiped while they still had their questions. They found themselves in this uncomfortable position, perhaps the same one we at times find ourselves in. Because as we gather here this morning at St. Mary's to worship in faith, who among us has never had questions about our faith? Who here has never had hesitancies or difficulties in faith? We have those here among us in our pews this morning who, in the wake of sudden and tragic loss in your life, have asked that question, why? There are some here among us in our pews this morning who, in patient and persevering prayer, have been asking God for some good thing for maybe years on end, and you've had that question of when? And there are some here in this church this morning who, in the face of wrongdoing, and yes, even at times wrongdoing done by members of the church or people in the name of Jesus, have asked yourself the question, how? Now, if you've ever had to find yourself in a place of worship and yet also hesitancy and difficulty, you are not the first person to come here to St. Mary's with that. One of our more famous former parishioners, the author Flannery O'Connor, who made St. Mary's her home when she was here in Iowa City, in her prayer journal, she began one of her entries with this line: "Dear God, I cannot love you like I want to." Dear God, I can't love you like I want to. What did she mean by that? I don't really know, but dear God, I can't love you because I've got these questions. I can't love you like I want to because I've got these hesitations. Dear God, I can't love you like I want to because I know my own weaknesses. Now, amidst all of this, what do we do? When we find ourselves with this desire to worship and yet with doubts, what do we do? Now, worship is not the consequence of having a perfect faith. Worship is the antidote to an imperfect faith. And a faith that is never tested is a faith that will never grow. And I believe it's actually in this place of difficulties in faith where the Lord is inviting us to make the greatest growth. And I just want to invite us to two things that we can do this morning. The first thing is to recognize that faith is a virtue, which means faith is a thing we have to put into practice. If we don't make acts of faith, if we don't put into practice faith, we will never grow. Just like if you never work out a muscle, it will atrophy and it will shrivel up. You have to stretch it and you have to work it. We've got the Regina baseball team with us here this morning. And you fellas know what it means to be in the weight room, to work the muscles, to be out on the field doing the fundamentals, and I doubt your coaches ever take it easy on you. Why? Because if they did, you're not going to grow. You're not going to become any better if it's all easy. Well, why would it not be the same thing in our lives of faith? Faith as a virtue means we have to practice faith. You know, this past winter, I shared with you this story of this man, this husband who decides he no longer was in love with his wife, and so he decided to divorce her, to leave her. Well, he takes her out to lunch one day, and it's there that he's going to break the news. But before he's ever able to get a word out, his wife starts to bawl. She is crying. The man in his head thinks, oh my gosh, how long has she known I don't love her anymore? But before he can say anything, she takes papers out of her purse, she hands them to him, and in no uncertain terms on those papers, the husband reads that his wife has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Now, in that moment, his intention to leave her changed, and he takes her home, and he cares for her every single day up to the day of her death. And by putting into practice these acts of care, these acts of service, these acts of love, what happens? He falls back in love with her. And then there's this line to this story that by acting like a man in love, he became a man in love again. By acting like a man in love, he became a man in love again. By acting like people in faith, what happens? We become people of faith. St. Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits, in his spiritual exercises, talks about these moments in our life, and we've all had them, that he calls spiritual desolation. And these are those moments in which God seems especially far or distant or extra invisible. And he says in these moments of spiritual dryness and desolation, what we need to do is redouble our spiritual practices. That it's actually in those moments when faith seems the most difficult that we need to double the amount of time we're praying. That we need to double our effort to get to the sacraments, to get to Mass. That by becoming people of faith, by acting like people of faith, we become people of faith. But the second thing I want us to invite us into this morning, amidst the difficulty at times we can have with faith, is to recognize that faith is not just this thing I manufacture. It's not just a thing I build on my own. It is a gift from God. And sometimes the greatest prayer you could ever make is, increase my faith. Increase my faith. There's this great line in the Gospel of Mark where we see this father whose son is sick, and he goes to Jesus and he asks Jesus to heal his son. And Jesus says, if you have faith, your son will be healed. And the father just responds, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. Which is another way of saying, Lord, I believe, but not really. Lord, I believe, but you need to increase my faith. You know, everybody, we find faith for what God has not done yet in our lives by recalling what God has already done. We find new faith for what God has not yet done in our life. We find faith for God being present in our life by celebrating the moments in our life in which God has been known and has made his presence well known. And when we do this, we grow as people of faith, that we can worship even while we have hesitancies. You know, at the end of the day, in our gospel today, when Jesus encounters those disciples who worship him but doubt, how does Jesus treat them? Did he scold them? Did he school them? No. He sent them. He sent them as they were, imperfect as they were. He says, hey, I want you to now share the little bit of faith you have to the world. Why? Because Jesus knew that the strength of their faith and our faith is not in us, but it's in him. That what ultimately saves us is not the quality of our faith, rather it's the object of our faith, who is Jesus. So I just want to end with this story. When I was growing up in Muscatine, every summer we would have what was called Great River Days. And it was the town carnival right there on the riverfront in downtown Muscatine. And I remember one summer night going down there with a pack of my cousins. And we went to one of these rides. I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's like the Ferris wheel that you're in this cage that starts spinning around as you go increasingly faster around the wheel. And I got paired up with a cousin of mine who is a little bit younger than me. His name is Tony. And as we get in the ride, you know, where we start going, we're making the ascent up to the top of the wheel. Things are going fine. But then it starts to pick up speed. And then we start turning around, and we're hanging at the apex of the Ferris wheel, and we're upside down for a moment. I'm feeling pretty confident. Because you know what? The chain-smoking carnival worker down below seemed pretty trustworthy to me. But my cousin Tony, he was crying like a little baby. And he was giving great testimony to his faith in that moment because everybody on the riverfront in Muscatine that evening heard him crying out prayers to saints I have never even heard of before. And there's one line, one prayer of his that's stuck in my mind. At one point, as we were going around and we're flipping around, he kept saying, "Mother Mary, make it stop." Now, at the end of that ride, which one of us survived? Was it me in my confidence, or was it Tony in his fear and his hesitation and his difficulty? The fact is, both of us survived. Because at the end of the day, that carnival worker and the ride, believe it or not, were trustworthy. And what ultimately saves us, what is ultimately our strength in faith, is not the quality of our subjective experience. It is the object of our faith, who is Jesus. Jesus who right now is alive. Jesus who right now is always and everywhere present. Jesus who amidst the ups and downs, the uncertainties, and the hiddenness of our lives, desires to encounter each one of us this morning.